So switching gears a little bit, I think there was labor market in everybody's talk. There's not going to be any labor market in this talk. But it is about frictions, obviously. It's about markups, and you're going to see it's very much an empirical paper. But I think it actually opens up questions that those of us who've been working in firm dynamics models, both theoretically and empirically, in some respects have been neglecting. And I think our empirical work both raises questions about the recent evidence on rising markups, but also kind of raises questions. Okay, what have we been doing for the last 30 years, and how should we be doing things differently? So the starting point, and I'll try not to spend all my time summarizing this great paper by DeLoca, Eckert, and Unger. It's in the QJE. You probably know it in 2020, or at least know of it. The results are really provocative. So taken at face value, and you'll see this, I think, on the second or the third slide, markups in the United States, basically for the entire U.S. Economy, went up from around, in 1980, about 20% to about 60, 70% by the end of their sample, basically by 2010 or so. Part of the narrative, indeed it's part of their story, that this is connected to changing concentration of activity in the United States. So as we'll see, a key part of their story is actually, it's not so much that there's an increase in the markup within firms, but rather there's a reallocation of activity away from low markup firms to high markup firms. Who are the high markup firms? They're the big guys. And so that turns out most of the action. And so it's not surprising for those, again, who have been kind of following all this debate that I don't think they were published literally in the same issue, but there's this paper by Otter et al. On rising superstars in the United States. And these papers kind of fed on each other over the last 3 or 4 years in terms of kind of getting attention. So I think it's gotten lots of attention in the academic community. It's had a huge impact. I shouldn't say for better or worse. I'm just going to say it's had a huge impact on economic policy debate. The Biden administration issued a directive basically last year on many ways based upon the superstars paper and the markups paper, arguing that antitrust enforcement and regulation needed to change given what's going on and changing nature of antitrust. Part of it is, back in the day, antitrust was trying to go after the guys in the back room and in the smoke-filled room, fixing ready-mix concrete or cement prices. And now increasingly, of course, it's the tech firms that are dominating the story, and the nature of collusive activity, or maybe not inclusive activity, of antitrust activity has changed. So that's all like a big intro, but partly I want to emphasize. I mean, hopefully our paper is a reasonably big deal. This question's like a first order big deal, and if DeLoca, Eckert, and Unger are approximately right, something's fundamentally changed in the United States. So when you go look, when you go and look under the hood, you discover they do something, I'll say, very clever and actually very simple, but also very indirect. And it's actually an idea that Bob Hall had back in the, hopefully I'm going to remember, back in the 80s. He used industry level data, they use firm level data. And as we'll sort of see, you can in principle back out the markup from the first order condition on a variable factor of production. If you know, here's the big if you know the production technology for the variable factor of production. If you know it, and basically if you know the output elasticity and you measure the cost share of revenue, we'll go over that in just a second in more detail, then the markup for a general demand function, you don't have to specify the demand function at all. It basically comes out of a quite general demand function. You don't have to say, obviously CES, which, and with oligopolistic competition, or VES or anything like that. You'll get the markup directly. So that's what they do, and mostly what they do, because they wanted to look for a long period of time, is they use data for publicly traded firms. They use the CompuStat data. And so I'll show you the statistic of going from 20 to 60% is coming all out of CompuStat. Now, they got I remember it was at the NBR Summer Institute where they first presented this paper. I mean, not surprising you present such a provocative result. The room was in an uproar about, wait, how can this be? And so they got a fair amount of pushback and got pushed to go work with the you could say the gold standard data at the Census Bureau. And what they did, I think, was a nice step forward. But they used, I'll say it's still very powerful data, the economic census data. So every 5 years in the United States, we have literally a census of all establishments in the economy. And that provides you enough data, particularly for manufacturing, but even for non-manufacturing, to be able to explore their approach. Again, we're going to get into the weeds here really pretty quickly. You can't do everything that they did. You end up having to use what's called a cost share approach for estimating the output elasticity. Why? Because in the literature, again, for those of you who are not so familiar in the firm dynamics literature, what's grown up in the last 30 years is we've all been trying to estimate production functions, and a series of papers, Ali and Pecos, Levinson Petrin, Ackerberg, Caves and Fraser, a whole series of papers have developed these control function proxy methods that have become incredibly popular, but they require lots of data. They're very data hungry methods and lots of lags. And if you only have data every 5 years, you basically can't implement. So it does turn out, so again, they uproar when they first presented this paper, I think it was like 2016, 17. As you'll see, the economic census results largely confirm their patterns, subject to this issue that I talked about. You can't use the sophisticated econometric methods. So in the background, and I should have mentioned it at the top, I feel bad. So this is co-authored with Lucia Foster and Cody Tuttle. They're part of a larger team at Census where we've been building it for years, but we've now built it so there are public domain products that you could use, not on markups, by the way, but on dispersion of productivity measures inside detailed industries. It's called DISP, if you're interested, DISP. But it's also the data set if you actually happen to work in the research data centers in the United States and you use the productivity data, I say for better or worse, we build it. And the nice part is for the manufacturing sector, we've actually got basically representative longitudinal panels. There's some panel rotation issues, which I won't spend time on today, but you need to worry about some. But basically from 1972 to almost really the present. We only use it through 2014 because that basically is when DeLocher et al. So that meant that we, instead of what DeLocher et al. Did, which was just the economic census analysis, we could basically bring in their firepower, basically in terms of the control function methods. But it was more than that. So it turns out again these methods are very data hungry. These control function methods, and they're using CompuStat. That's not that big a data set, right? It's you're tracking 10,000 firms, maybe even over a long period of time. You'd like to allow the production technology to vary across different kinds of businesses. For the most part, what they did with CompuStat, it was like 2-digit industry, which is really at the firm level, which is incredibly crude for those who are actively engaged in this literature. Unlike that, we could go to very detailed industry, and it's more than just that. We could also allow for the production technology to be time varying. Essentially, estimate this class of models, these control function models, over rolling windows. Now, DeLocher et al. Did some of that as well, but they just couldn't push the data. They basically ran out of observations. And so instead, we can push the data really hard. So since I'm taking forever in this introduction, I'll at least tell you the punchline, and obviously we'll want to get through the details of our finding. Is when we free up the technology, that is, we essentially allow, in many ways, our most flexible cases, we allow establishment level differences in technology. So instead of assuming that everybody has the same technology in the same 2-digit industry or even 4-digit industry, we allow for every establishment to have a different technology. Now, do we have that much data and is that so easy to do? The answer is no, but there are production function specifications like the Translog. It turns out the Translog by construction gives you establishment level elasticities. And if you do it on a rolling year basis, you're going to see when we do this, we basically clobber their result. It goes away. So instead of there being an increase in markups, we basically get nothing.
Is that because markups are always high, or
No, they're still basically where they were back in the 1980s. Okay, so we don't get the rise in markups, and I'll go ahead and take the question, and then you could say, should you believe our results? So that's going to be mostly what the talk's going to be about. But happy to take questions. Yeah, go ahead.
And if you treat the data you're going to use the way they did, you'll get that result.
Yes, I'm going to show you. That's actually going to be our baseline. Is we're going to say, oh, even though we've got this much better data, let's do exactly what they did, and we can replicate their results. That's exactly right. All right. So the other piece of the paper, you could say the main part of the paper is what I've just said, and wow, I'm just terrible job today. I don't know why such a long introduction. So you might be nervous. You say, did we just somehow throw noise at the problem, right? It's like you've got these a large number of output elasticities, and this is some sort of attenuation error bias. Okay, so we actually go look. Fortunately, in the data, there's lots of observable indicators of establishments within and between industries doing things differently. What do I mean by that? We have data like on computer investment per worker. We have data on changing capital intensity. We have data on whether this is something that the trade folks have been really picking up on, people like Teresa Fort at Dartmouth. Increasingly, there's a subset of manufacturing which are becoming what's called factoryless producers. That is, they do a little bit of manufacturing, but they mostly offshored or outsourced to someplace else in the United States, some other kind of firm, the production activity, but they're doing mostly design and a little bit of manufacturing. And so there are indicators. We're going to use the Teresa Ford indicator of that diversification. There's also, I've already talked about, there's a huge change in the size distribution. We're going to find all of these observable indicators are highly correlated with the variation in our output elasticities and in our markup. So it's going to, that's not causal evidence, but it's certainly, I'll say, consistent evidence that what we're picking up in terms of the differences in output elasticities and markups across establishments is highly correlated with observable indicators of differences in technology across businesses. All right. Yikes. Okay. So let's move on. So first substantive slide is not from us, it's from them, just to get in your head if you're not familiar with this paper. So the left figure, I'll say, summarizes, I think, the main result in Deloker at Unger. And it's not until figure 4, but I actually think it's their first figure just has the red line, that's the headline statistic that I talked to you about, okay, 1980 to 2013. And so you can see this huge increase in key is that they argue that you want to look at some activity-weighted markup. And there's been debate in the literature about exactly whether that's true or not, and actually, for the most part, the answer is yes. The question is, what activity weights do you want to use? And we could go spend time on that. That's not what I'm going to spend so much time on today. But one of the things they do is a simple decomposition, basically a shift-share decomposition in terms of how much of that really striking increase in markups is due to the within firm. You can see that's the blue line kind of at the bottom, versus the others are essentially reallocation effects, either reallocation amongst existing businesses. And by that I mean, for that term to be rising, it's got to be the case that sales are being reallocated away from low markup firms, small low markup to high markup firms. That's what's going on in the data. And it's also the case that net entry also contributes. So if you put those two together, that's most of the story. They didn't do the decomposition in terms of within between for economic census. This is sort of, you could say the right was their robustness check. You send it off to the QJE, referees pound you, and they said, look, We want to see this for more than just publicly traded firms. And so this is just for the manufacturing. They did other sectors as well. Now we're only going to be about manufacturing. So that's why I'm showing you this. And I'll make it clear what I mean by 1 year, 4-digit cost share approach in just a second. Okay, but that's the left-hand side, they use the control function approach. The right-hand side, they use the cost share approach. And you know, the two figures aren't directly comparable because one's the whole economy, one's manufacturing, but still very kind of consistent story. And by the way, they find big effects in some other sectors as well. So what did they do? It's sort of, you know, it's a clever idea, you know. Again, you got to give Bob Hall lots of credit. He's a very clever guy. His point is, you know, that, and lots of us in the profession have been exploiting first order conditions for variable factors of production. They're really simple, right? So just in terms of defining terminology, theta ITV in principle, by the way, that's the output elasticity of the variable factor for establishment or firm I. In our case, we're going to go all the way to the establishment level, which we think is the right place to go for technology. That's a parameter you need. Data is the cost share of revenue. Alpha ITV is the cost share of revenue of that variable factor, and particularly for manufacturing, we've got that variable, and I say we measure it well. In non-manufacturing sectors, and DeLoca et al. And lots of people, we don't have really great. Going too fast a little bit. In manufacturing, when I say we've got it, we've actually got great materials data. So we have really fantastic materials data. That's part of what the annual survey of manufacturers and the census of manufacturers do. Why do we have such good data there? Because they use this to build the national income and product accounts, and they've developed good methods for doing this. And so I say high quality data in terms of alpha ITV. I'll talk about other sectors in a second. So you can basically see this is one equation and two unknowns, right? So what's the left-hand side? The markup. So for a general demand function, the markup's going to be equal to this ratio. Okay, you don't have to put. Basically, all you have to assume is the demand function is downward sloping, and for a general demand function, you can derive this this equation, and they do in their paper. Lots of people, Bob Hall did, and so on. Now. And here's sort of where, as I said, we don't want this just to be viewed as a paper as a comment on DeLoca or Ecken and Unger. They and lots of us. So I'm somebody who's been studying productivity dispersion for a very long period of time, and lots of us have been using it. Whether like Nick Bloom has used it for measures of uncertainty. Increasingly in the last 15 years, dispersion and revenue productivity dispersion has been used as a measure of misallocation. Because, as Shea Klenow appropriately pointed out in 2009, if indeed we're talking about variable factors of production, marginal revenue products, and it's a frictionless, distortionless economy, marginal revenue products ought to be equalized, and we should see no dispersion in revenue productivity. But we see enormous amount, by the say, even in the United States. And just as a quick aside, you know, what was the Shea Klenow paper? It was that even though in the United States we have really high revenue productivity dispersion, it's actually much lower than in China and India. And then they calibrated a model and said we can account for the GDP per capita or the productivity differences across these countries with misallocation, basically. And they weren't the first to come up with this idea, but basically they could because they really sort of nailed it. And there's been enormous literature. And again, it's all based upon if you just what Shea Klenow does. It's essentially based upon alpha IT variation, alpha ITV. So that's the data. And they assumed, by the way, their first version, they just assumed the same technology for every industry and every country and every time period, the usual thing. I'm a macroeconomist. So they assumed 2/3, 1/3 in a value-added production function, right? That's what they assumed the output elasticities. They freed that up since. That's not where all the bodies are buried. But part of the whole point is they kind of grabbed that revenue productivity dispersion residual and said, oh, there's lots of dispersion. We don't know how to account for it. And they're gonna call that distortions. In many ways, that's what DeLoca, Eckert, and Unger are doing. They're just labeling that particular distortion something specific, and that is if you use the first order condition in this way, it's the markup. Okay, so no. No. This condition, write out the first order condition. I don't have that in the slide deck, but go read the first part of, and I want to just sort of assert. But no, this condition is quite general. All right, so I've already hinted at, and given where I am in terms of time, I'm going to have to speed up a little bit. But essentially, okay, how are we going to get the thetas? So one method is this control function, and that's sort of the mainline results. And I'm going to talk a little bit about, briefly, given where I'm in time, but briefly about what DeLoca, Eckert, and Unger do. And I think I'll say all three of them, but I'll say particularly Jan DeLoca, he's been at the cutting edge of this literature in terms of estimation of these kind of control function models in a whole series of papers over the last 15 years. So if you, in many ways, if you wanted to have one person do this, you probably want it to be, so there's a small subset, Ariel Pekis, Jan DeLoca, and so on. Jan's thought hard and long about the issues. And they do some cool things, as we'll talk about in a second. So the second thing is, you can exploit the cost minimization for a variable factor of reduction, and you can back out the output elasticity as the cost share, not of revenue, but the cost share of total costs. And lots of us do that. Indeed, the statistical agencies. So BLS turns out TFP statistics, and the equivalent, I'm sure, in Canada. How do they produce those TFP statistics? Just what I said. They basically compute the cost share of total costs as the output elasticities. BLS computes them at a reasonably disaggregated industry level, so I presume Stats Canada does as well. And that's how we produce the productivity statistics. So a very common method for estimating output elasticities is to do that. Okay, so let me walk through briefly like a huge literature that's sort of emerged over the last 15, actually more than that. So Ali Pekis was in 1996, so that's more than 15 years, obviously a long time ago. So old question in firm dynamics and productivity dynamics, how to estimate the production function, right? And the key here is we need, and I'm using exactly intentionally here DEU's notation. To estimate actually theta V, I also need to estimate the output elasticities for the other factors of production in principle. So I'll say the standard approach in the, I'm going to call it the IO, particularly my IO macro, but even just IO. So I don't think Ariel Pekis would appreciate me calling him a macroeconomist. It is and to estimate these things is actually to assume that the output elasticities vary at the industry level and don't even vary over time. That's sort of the standard. That's sort of like the workhorse. And to their credit, DeLoca, Eckert, and Unger said, well, wait a second, we're looking over a long period of time, and it very well might be the case that industries are producing things differently as time goes on, and so we should at least put a T on. All right. So they worry about that. The other thing they worry about more than like Ali Pekis and Levins and Petrin and Ackerbrook Case Frazier, everybody talks about their estimating a production function, and none of us have been estimating production functions. Why? Because we don't actually measure QIT. Almost none, and there's some exceptions. I'm working with great data in Colombia. Some of you might, there's great data in various countries. Belgium has some great data where you actually have plant level prices. And by the way, it's complicated because you literally need plant level prices for multi-product producers. So you need actually product level prices at the plant level. Some countries have that. The United States, for the most part, doesn't. Some of us, so I've done work with Chad Severson and Lucia Foster, where, like for ready mixed concrete, if you know Chad's work and whatever, we do actually have those plant level prices. But for the most part, we don't. So again, to look back at Unger, remember for CompuStat, this is what they did as CompuStat. They recognized that even though we'd like the left-hand side variable to be QIT, it's not. It's Q. Everything's in logs here. It's QIT plus PIT. Okay, and so we're really estimating revenue functions, and for some purposes that's just fine because then you make assumptions and you say, I'm fine with the revenue elasticity. So suppose what I'm trying to do is just estimate the revenue function and extract the residual, and I'm Hugo Hoppenheim and I'm Mark Mellitz, and I just need the to understand the distribution of productivity of I'm going to call it revenue shocks. Then estimating the revenue function is fine, but they're not in that world, right? Because the whole point here is they're trying to split out what's going on the demand side versus the production side. So they want to take seriously the fact that they can't estimate what they'd like, but they still want to recover theta v. So basically they starting from omega on they recognize, well, wait a second, in the residual are prices. All right, now what they do about that isn't great, but you could say it's an advance over much of the literature. Essentially what they do is they assume that there's a potentially nonlinear relationship between those price terms and market shares. And so much of the proxy literature is essentially treating omega as it's proxied by some higher order polynomial in the inputs. They essentially do the same thing for this term. They're basically just assuming, well, we don't know what that relationship is, but we're just going to make it higher order term in markups, and then we're going to use GMM with lags. Basically, that's what you end up doing, right? So you put all this in and then say, okay, once I kind of recognize that omega IT is equal to, I make some assumption, an autoregressive assumption. I don't have to make it an AR1. I just make some general autoregressive relationship between omega IT and omega IT minus 1, use these proxy methods. So basically, I'm going to put polynomials in of, in many ways, lagged inputs and lag market shares. That's how you're going to proxy for these missing residuals. That's what's going on in this literature. Okay, so that's what they do, and I'll say, and in the CompuStat part of the paper, they do allow for the thetas to vary, as we'll see in just a second. The thetas to vary both across sectors and across time. All right, so now let me get to actually finally what we're doing. So I already told you we've got this great data set where we've got like 40 years of data. Again, I won't talk too much about the rotation of panels, but I'm able to I'll say estimate this whole class of models over very long periods of time, and it'll become clear in just a second. We're gonna consider over and over again. We're going to call the less detailed case, back again to your question, basically their baseline, and then the more detailed, and you'll see how detailed we get, is going to be where we push things really far in terms of output elasticities, and it's when we really push things really far in terms of output elasticities that we clobber their results. So one way of pushing things very far is to just say, look, I'm gonna assume, a very strong assumption that I can back out the output elasticity of the establishment by just using the ratio of the cost share of total costs for that establishment at each instant in time, so the top equation is sort of the standard thing the stat agencies do, but there's no reason I can't change that S to an I. Okay, so we do that, and it turns out that issues a markup that's actually been used in kind of both the accounting literature and the economics literature for a long time, which is one estimate of the markup is just the revenue to total cost ratio at the firm level, and we're hardly the first to come up with it. that tells you, by the way, to get this equation, you basically change these S's into I's, and this is what emerges, okay? So that's one of our cases. That's sort of more detail. But then we also want to do all this control function estimation, as I talked about before. All right, yeah, go ahead.
So, when doing this at the plant level, how much worry do we have about like measurement error and transitory issues and how the R, CCs, and so on are measured? Like, how much worry, we're getting kind of spurious changes in either state or year?
Well, one nice thing about the control function methods, at least, is if you believe, there's not foolproof, but basically all the identifications coming off of basically panel estimation techniques. So we know that one way we deal with measurement error is we use lagged instruments, right? And so to the extent that you think that we've overcome things with a rich set of lagged instruments, so basically almost nothing contemporaneous. Actually, we estimate the contemporaneous parameters, but we don't use the variation we're using are instruments which are all lags. Now, that's not perfect. We could quibble about that. So probably hard to read these tables. I'm going to kind of go show you the bottom line real quick. But I do want to get into your head, sort of, that as we and I'll make it clear which is the benchmark and which is the less detailed and the more detailed. But as you consider all these different specifications, you can see, look in the cost share approach. So if you do what much of the literature does, including myself and lots of papers for productivity dispersion, and you use, let's say you only have 2-digit output elasticities, and they're constant over time, you don't get a lot of variation, right? The dispersion and cost share elasticity is pretty small. Go all the way down to the plant level, and indeed dispersion and cost shares goes way up. Now, given Jason's question, again, you're going to see this over and over again. You might ask, okay, is that just noise, or are we picking something up? Okay, and so similar remarks apply also when we go to the control function, again, consistent with DEU. So to cut to the chase, but also to help us think about our results like their results, but in our data set. I'm going to show you a series of figures. This is the first of 3, where the dashed line is their baseline, basically. So, for example, notice, by the way, I always abbreviate that with DEU. So, Haltiwanger, their baseline, when they use the economic census data, remember that right picture I showed you? Basically, they freed things up, so they allowed that ST, so they actually allowed the output elasticities to in principle vary every year at an industry level, but at the 4-digit level. And so we do the same. Okay, that's the dashed line. And then we go to this a plant 1 year, where we basically allow the output elasticity to move with literally to be different across every plant and every year. And you can see, we don't clobber them completely in this case, but if you go check, our dash line here is very similar to what they had gotten for the economic census data. And whereas, basically you can see we knocked down substantially in this case. So if this is the case you want to believe, you'd say, well, we didn't eliminate their markups, we reduced it substantially. But let's keep going. So now let's go to the control function estimation. This isn't the most flexible. This is the Cobb-Douglas, and here again, what's the baseline of the CompuStat estimation by Haltiwanger and Unger? They allowed for the output elasticities to vary at the 2-digit level, and then they did rolling 5-year windows, basically always centered on the current year. So we did the same. That's our dash line. And then we said, okay, well, wait a second. We've actually got better data, better industry codes than CompuStat and more data. We can, with Cobb-Douglas, free this up and basically notice, by the way, that when we do this, we very much clobber their increase in markups. And then we go to what we regard as our preferred specification, because we say, well, wait a second, Cobb-Douglas is actually quite restrictive. So why not go to Translog? Because Translog allows you, even without literally estimating a production function for every establishment, because of the nature of the Translog, it's going to give you output elasticities that vary at the establishment level. So this is sort of our benchmark case. And so in the appendix of the Haltiwanger, they do exactly what our dash line is, but by the way, for CompuStat. And they allow for the translog coefficients to vary at the 2-digit level. Because it's translog, you're pushing the data pretty hard. They don't actually allow for any time variation. But there is, by construction, there is time variation because of the translog. As the shares change, there's going to be changes in the output elasticities. And then you can see, if you go, we regard this as why do we regard this as our best case? Because it's the most flexible of functional form. And I'll say we're using estimation methods that are more reliable than the cost share method. I was kind of blitzing through there. So what are you assuming when you use the cost share method? You're essentially assuming all factors of production are variable. And we don't believe that, right? I mean, particularly this room doesn't believe it. But believes all factors of production, including capital. And so by the way, you might say, well, don't the stat agencies know better than to use those? Well, oftentimes the assumption is that the first order conditions for inputs, for minimizing costs, hold on average over time. And so by using a long run average, that's sort of a good proxy. So Chad Severson in his 2011 Journal of Economic Literature paper on productivity says that's been the justification for years for using output elasticities that were time varying. They said, yeah, of course, capital is not a variable factor of production, but at least on average over long periods of time, those first order conditions approximately hold, and that's been the argument. So anyway, so obviously we get, I'll say, we get dramatically different. You can see, and again, something I hadn't quite mentioned, dramatically different patterns in terms of the increasing markups. If we use what we regard as their baseline, we get pretty substantial increases in markups. If you use our more flexible, you actually get modest declines. So one thing I didn't emphasize, it's actually, if you look carefully at their results, and in some sense, I say our results are, particularly for manufacturing, slightly more informative because we don't just have data every 5 years, is whether it's us or them for manufacturing, and let's use their methods. Markups actually peak in 2007. They start coming down. So you can see, like even the baseline here, using the translog, it's 1977 to 2007. That's a 41% increase in markups. But again, even if we use their baseline, it's only a 27%. And that's sitting in their results. People didn't really emphasize that, partly because they just had snapshots of the data in various periods of time, so it was unclear. We wanted to make such a big deal, but we actually, literally, we can fill in all the years. So it does look like, post 2007, basically, there's even from the, kind of their approach, there's a decline in markups. Yeah, go ahead. Sure, go ahead. Yeah. So we have used labor as the variable input, and we get quite similar results. I would actually think in this audience, I don't think labor is a variable factor of production. Exactly. Okay. Yeah. So I think that lots of people have been using labor, and I actually think that's partly why the manufacturing results are, I think, more convincing, because I think materials and energy are much closer to variable factors of production. So we actually get pretty similar results. It's in the appendix of our paper, but I find that assumption even less plausible. Okay. So I at least I achieved the one piece of, I mean, whet your appetite to say, look, if you free up the production technology in sensible ways using good data, it looks as though results are sensitive to this. So we want to dig further. We want to kind of go after their mainline story, and also ask the question, what's the connection between what we're seeing and observable change of technology? Because underlying our story is establishments in the same industry in the same period of time are doing business differently. That's what we're about. And if that's going to be true, I mean, it could be true. And again, if you just take our estimates at face value, that's what we're saying. We're getting substantial dispersion in the thetas and in systematic ways that accounts for the markups. But you'd be much happier if indeed the patterns it didn't just look like noise. Okay, so I want to walk you through a couple of arguments to tell you. And what's the time about?
Yeah, 10 minutes.
Okay, good. So remember one of their stories. One of their key results is it's not just that there's this rising aggregate markup, but it's a reallocation story, right? That it's a shift away from low markup firms to high markup firms. And actually, quite interestingly, that within firm markups aren't going up so much. So we want to go after that a little bit, but by the way, underlying that story is dispersion in markups. And one of the things we find across, so every time you see less detailed, it's their best baseline. Every time more detailed, it's our most flexible form. I'll say consistent with, and I'm going to show you more about this, but kind of consistent with this idea that we're starting to soak up some of their dispersion in markups basically with the dispersion in technology. That's what we're doing. And this is our prima facie evidence of that. We're just showing you the dispersion of markups for the less detailed and more detailed cases, and you can see it drops substantially. So I'm going to say more compellingly, we want to go do exactly what they did in terms of the decomposition, right? So the decomposition that really striking figure from their paper, figure 4, showed you that the sales weighted increase in markups, was primarily coming from reallocation effects. And this is exactly the decomposition they use. It's a simple decomposition. Can I say it's a decomposition I developed a long time ago? There's nothing rocket science here about it. This is just shift share with entry and exit, right? That's all it is. So there's the first term's within, so that the second two terms are basically the reallocation terms amongst continuing businesses. The third term, the fourth term is entry, and the fifth term is exit. And like them, I'm going to show you some of these subcomponents are interesting, but I'm going to show you basically the within, the reallocation, and the net entry. Okay. So here's what you get, and I'll say we were very struck by these patterns. So remember, this is for manufacturing, and unfortunately we didn't actually remember they never did their decomposition for manufacturing from the economic census data. They just, as a robustness check, they said, oh yeah, when I use a cost share approach, I still get rising markups. But our closest case is the top line, because it turns out that this is just what they did for the economic census data. So they used 4-digit industry output elasticities that varied every year. And if we look at first let's just look at the total change column. The total change in markups is about what they got, okay, over this period of time. And so you could say one tiny contribution here is we do a decomposition, and the flavor of that decomposition is very similar to theirs. So what would we say is true? There's quite a large increase in markups from 1980 to 2012. Why did we do this? Why did we pick that period? Because that's exactly the period of time they have the economic census data. And we would say it's almost all reallocation plus net entry, that the within term is actually quite small. So we regard this as both, value added relative to them because they didn't do this for manufacturing, but very much consistent. So in each, the way this table works is, first row is their baseline, and then the next row is our detailed, and so on and so forth. Now, remember, we don't have anything to compare to in their other baseline for manufacturing. We can only kind of look at to see what they did for CompuStat, and that's sort of apples and oranges. So first, let's just look at the total change column. So very much consistent with what I've already shown you is every time you go from I'll say the first row, the less detailed to the more detailed, the total change falls pretty significantly. You go from 32% to 18%, you go from 11% to -5%, you go from 31% to -5%. And you might say, oh, those look like they're slightly different numbers than before. Well, I'm using precisely the 82 to 2012. So tiny differences, not tiny, but differences whether you use 77 versus 2012 and so on. So the total change thing kind of is consistent with what you've seen already. So the column that kind of blew us away, actually, is the within column. So notice in all of our detailed cases, if we believe our numbers, and I got to make sure I at least have 5 minutes or whatever to spend on convincing you that there's a chance our numbers are right, actually the withins are all pretty big and negative. So we would say the average establishment, sales weighted, in the United States actually has a decline in markups. That's a very different narrative, not just flat, but decline. Something's going on, so actually markups are declining. Now, here's where I'll say they are right and the superstar paper is right. There has been a huge shift in activity in the United States away from basically young small firms to large mature firms. Just enormous shift within and between industries. And so notice the reallocation terms are all still positive, even in all of our more detailed cases. They tend not to be, by the way, I don't know quite we don't quite know to make a bit about the fact that it's so big in the cost share approach, but for our preferred specification, again, our preferred specification is the last two rows. So we would say, oh, if you allowed for, by literature standards, pretty flexible technologies, two-digit industry, Translog, you'd say the markup had increased by 31%, modest negative within, but quite big reallocation terms. And so very much consistent, and we've got results in the paper. Just like them, we do find, and somebody asked this question earlier, larger businesses have larger markups. Okay, and so that's present in their findings and ours. And so we're getting a pretty big kick, but partly what's really dragging things down is we're getting this huge negative within. All right, so 5 minutes maybe? 2. Okay, so let me just go kind of bring this home a little bit. So lots of us have noticed when we've used the establishment level data is when we go inside industries, businesses look incredibly different on many different margins. And here I'm just showing you 4 different margins. So I'm showing you both changes in means. These are all, when I say unweighted, means and dispersion. In many ways, the dispersion are as equally as interesting as the mean. So we know manufacturing's become more capital intensive over time. That's the upper left. We know it's become more tech intensive. So computer investment per worker has been growing over time. Teresa Fort is the lower left-hand share. We actually know that it's literally the fraction of the parent firm's activity that's outside of manufacturing. That's the Teresa Fort measure. So you could say it's a diversification index outside of manufacturing. That's been growing particularly as we get past the late 1990s. Log firm share is literally what the parent firm, and one nice thing here when we're thinking about size, we're always careful about not establishment size, but firm size, that the parent firm mean, basically the kind of market share on average has been going up. That's very much consistent with the increased concentration. But you can also see, except for the lower right, and there's kind of a reason for that, obviously, as things get more and more concentrated, actually dispersion is going to fall. But you can see enormous dispersion as well. Just if you just look at the magnitudes here, enormous dispersion across all these. So you know, one thing lots of us have noticed is that all these different indicators of businesses doing business differently there's lots of dispersion across plants. So I'm essentially out of time. So we do a whole bunch of micro analysis, but let me just finish with these last two slides. So we look to see, in this particular exercise, we do plant level and industry level. It turns out some of the patterns that I've talked about very much vary across industries. So there are some industries that have become much more computer intensive relative to others. That's not so surprising. Think about it. Leather versus semiconductors, okay, in manufacturing. Some industries have become much more capital intensive than others. If we just break the just industries alone and just ask what's happening to basically the gap between the less versus more detailed markups, very much associated with the changing patterns, depending what, and by the way, whether within industries or between industries. I'm going to skip the within industry stuff. Whether I use computer intensity, capital intensity, or Teresa force measure. So I'll stop here. So question, have markups increased in the United States? We would say we're not sure. At least in the US manufacturing sector, we would say no. What do we think is happening instead? We actually think, at least in the manufacturing sector, that businesses are increasingly doing business differently. And that all of us who are trying to interpret various measures of dispersion in things like cost shares of revenue or labor shares related to the question earlier and so on, need to recognize that an important component of all that may be very well that businesses are adopting technologies in a different kind of way, reorganizing themselves in a very different kind of way. And when we take that into account, at least in this space, that raises questions about markups. I'll stop. Thank you.